I think it's astounding in many ways that a disease where 3/4 of any MS population is women, that this is one of our gaps.
There were things that would come up that were sort of well established or that we had known about women's health, that it was quite clear that information wasn't getting out to the community and to patients with MS.
We ended up with this landscape of we actually don't know a lot about a lot of areas, which means we need to find a way to fill in those gaps. How are we going to do that? And how are we going to make sure that we get adequate input to do that?
The general interest in women's health in MS, to see 1,400 people respond to our initial global survey just because they got an email and they took a few minutes out of their day. Hello, I'm Dr. Lindsay Ross. I'm an assistant professor at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine and a staff neurologist at the Mellon Center for Multiple Sclerosis Treatment and Research at the Cleveland Clinic. And I suppose I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio as well.
Hi, Ruth Ann Marrie, and I am a professor of medicine and community health sciences at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada, where I am also the medical director of the Provincial Multiple Sclerosis Program.
And I'm Brett Drummond. You're listening to the ECTRIMS podcast, the official podcast from the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis. Everyone listening to this podcast would agree that research into MS is critical. However, in a landscape where funding is increasingly difficult to obtain, the importance of conducting research that has the greatest impact has never been more important. Considering this, how do researchers find a balance between undertaking projects that provide information of scientific value with those that deliver direct, meaningful benefits to people living with MS? And who should be consulted when making those decisions? My guests in this episode, Ruth Ann and Lindsay, were recently involved in a large-scale scoping review of important MS research areas related to female health, which we will be discussing today. Ruth Ann, Lindsay, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So I think to start with, probably to give a background as to where all of this came from. The review was conducted sort of on behalf of the International Advisory Committee on Clinical Trials in MS. Can you give us a bit of information about who that group is?
Sure. So the International Advisory Committee on Clinical Trials in MS is an effort jointly supported by ECTRIMS and the National MS Society, and it's a committee that was really put together to provide guidance to the community around clinical trials, so things that are relevant to clinical trial design as well as important clinical issues. So the committee has been responsible for the clinical course descriptors related to multiple sclerosis, typically has included things like the diagnostic criteria in its work. So big efforts that occur recurrently, but there's also an opportunity for the committee to identify individual topics that it thinks may be important from a clinical and research perspective, even if they aren't directly related to clinical trials.
Yeah, and I should just add, maybe as it relates to our work, that I'm not personally on the committee, and several of our other authors were not as well, brought on for different reasons related to the particular topic we focused on or different skill sets. So the majority of our author team was part of the clinical trial committee, either when this started or at different points, because I think this work ended up spanning about 4 years, but not all of us.
Okay, fantastic. Well, talk about the specific topic, so let's jump to that. I sort of brought it up in the intro slightly, but I guess before we get into the specifics of what you looked into and what you found, why did the committee decide that a focus needed to be placed on women's health in MS in particular?
Well, there are always a lot of questions that we think we don't know enough about and want to be engaged in. And so a few years ago, we had a conversation about where should the committee next focus its efforts. And there was an enormous emphasis on women's health, I think for a few reasons. One, with all of the new emerging therapies that we use, this has really created some additional complexity around a lot of women's health life stages, pregnancy, and some of those kinds of issues. But I think the committee is comprised heavily of clinicians who also identified women's health as being an area where there are enormous knowledge gaps that affect our ability to inform patients and make good clinical decisions every day. And so although there were a number of topics on the list, this one really rose to the top as being one that we should take a look at.
To piggyback on that, I wasn't privy to the committee deciding to focus on this, but a reason that we as an author team sort of thought this was all important, as well as, there's historically been a lack of focus on women's health research. And I can speak more specifically, I suppose, to the U.S. perspective, being from the States. I can't claim this all globally, but dating back 1985, there was a public health service task force that came out in the U.S. and said the historical lack of research and focus on women's health has really compromised the quality of health information available to women and the health care they received. And as we were doing this work, focusing on women with MS, we saw that in the MS literature. Up until about 2004, there weren't more than 10 studies published in any year that focused on women's health issues. And so there's just been sort of this historical gap. And as Ruth Ann was pointing out, we need as clinicians to be able to help our patients provide this information, and we want to do it in an evidence-based way, and sort of organizing that effort appeared, important both clinically and when you sort of looked at what was available.
I was going to say, I think it's astounding in many ways that a disease where 3/4 of any MS population is women, that this is one of our gaps, and so that's I think another important driver behind this work.
I was about to ask exactly the same question, just in terms of, is it actually surprising that we have this huge knowledge gap, considering the difference we see in terms of the 3-to-1 ratio?
Yeah, I think how we got there, I think we can speculate, but I think it makes the gap all the more important. And so it really pushed us to try and figure out exactly what we did and didn't know, like what areas had been looked at. So, we had our ideas about what was missing, but that really, drove us to start this project, which has many layers. So, we got Lindsay involved when we were starting with just the, let's do a scoping review and see what studies have been done about what topics and who have they engaged as a starting point. And it was actually a bit worse even than I thought it would be in many respects. So, really focusing on the areas that we as clinicians often pay attention to. So things like pregnancy and disease-modifying therapies, but all of these other life stages that women go through were really, understudied. And, I think was something I think Lindsay spent a lot of time. You spent a lot of time thinking about and looking at the other literature, trying to understand more about, why don't we have very few studies on menopause when we again consider what's the peak age of MS populations in many parts of the world. Well, it's in that 50 to 65 year age range, so it's a life stage that many women with MS are going through, and yet we can't advise them about it.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest surprise to me when we started getting into this was, at the time, sort of the dearth of research and the menopause piece. When you even think about most women, getting diagnosed in their 20s and 30s, and then the universality of the experience of menopause for females. Especially, some people may or may not choose to get pregnant or end up with gynecological cancers, for example. But almost all the women with MS will have their diagnosis by the time they go through menopause, and they've got to co-manage their disease and deal with menopause. And we had just very little information on which to guide them. I think that was, as you pointed out, one of the biggest surprises so far.
We've sort of touched upon the processes that were implemented in terms of doing this review, but I'd be interested in going into a bit more detail in that, in particular the people who were consulted during the process, because I think that's a really critical part of the review that was performed.
Yeah, so we did sort of a multi-stage project. So the scoping review was really the starting point. So for that, we used, what we considered sort of standard methods in terms of, finding a systematic review librarian. So Lindsay did a lot of work with that individual for us to come up with a comprehensive strategy and getting input from members of our team about what topics to look at. And we went through like 112,000 abstracts to try and get down to the final set of studies. And as Linda pointed out, we found lots of gaps. But I think it's really what came after that, which was the most important part in terms of consulting others. So, we ended up with this landscape of we actually don't know a lot about a lot of areas, which means we need to find a way to fill in those gaps. How are we going to do that? And how are we going to make sure that we get adequate input to do that? And that's really where we worked on a strategy, and Lindsay did a lot of work looking at some of the different options because we wanted to get global input. So the trials committee is an international effort, so we wanted to try and engage people across the globe, and we'd identified in the scoping review that a lot of the literature came from Europe and North America and not much in any other parts of the world, and that mostly people who self-identified as white were the people participating in these studies, and generally with less disability. And so we wanted to find a way to get that information and perspectives from a broader range of people. And so Lindsay, maybe worth going through some of the thought process that we did, and then how hard it is to actually get to what you want to do when you have an idea, and how do you actually get there.
Yeah, so it's fortunate to have this group of authors that helped me make some of these decisions too, and not just with Anne and I, but in considering, how we went about sort of priority setting and how to fill in the gaps and advise the research community. There's, maybe 6 or 7 different options for priority setting that I looked at, included the James Lind Alliance, global evidence mapping, the dialogue model, choosing all together, just sort of to name a few, and they all have different pros and cons. And we ended up sort of choosing the James Lind Alliance model to base our priority setting after, which in short, really starts with identifying current gaps in knowledge and then tries to bring different stakeholders together to create and prioritize research questions in response to the gaps. But we modified this in a way that's sort of not standard, trying to allow, as Ruth Ann was mentioning, people to participate from around the world and make it easy to participate. So we broke what's typically a big workshop and just sort of a one-day event into several different stages that started with an initial global survey that was sent out through a bunch of different MS organizations, as well as to some neurologists across the globe that helped disseminate this, and asked people, and they could be people with MS, their care partners, clinicians, researchers, patient advocates, all kinds of different people, what topics within women's health they would prioritize for future research initiatives. And then once we had that data, we gathered together in focus groups, led with some help by Marcia Finlayson, one of our co-authors on this study, to get into more details within those priority topics. What do people really want to know? What interests them? And have a discussion about it to try to get in details. And then when that was done, we sent out a follow-up survey back around the globe through these many different organizations that were so kind to help us out, to actually have people rank those research questions that we came up with in the focus groups to say, all right, so, within pregnancy, our number one question is, what are the long-term effects of disease-modifying therapies on children of persons with MS? And question number 2 is, how does disease-modifying therapies affect the ability to become pregnant? And just try to really pin it down to what do people want to know, and trying to think about how we can most broadly include a range of people in getting this information out there and getting their opinions.
How important, personally, I think it's fantastic that there are people living with MS in the MS community were included as part of the process in terms of finding the questions that are obviously going to be the most relevant to people living with MS. But how important was it for you and for the committee that this was part of the process that was used during this?
I think it was incredibly important. The trials committee traditionally hasn't developed its topics in this way before. So, we often hold workshops, and we may have, a couple people with MS there, but we've kind of picked the ideas and what we think is important and where to focus in advance. And we really wanted to try something different here and see how that would evolve. Would we get further? Would the questions be richer? Would they be more appropriate? And I think Lindsay and Lindsay can add her comments, both had the experience, because unlike qualitative researchers, we haven't had as much exposure to participating in focus groups. Those are really very rich discussions, and people shared an enormous amount about their experiences in helping to come up with these questions. And as I was listening to them, some of the things I heard, I was like, yeah, I've heard that before. So that part wasn't new, but there were things that, provided a different perspective. So, Marcia, for instance, commented, so she has done a lot of clinical trials and work related to fatigue management. And one of the things at the top of the list that came out as a priority question was basically fatigue management for parents, right? So that's a particular role. And so we talk a lot about fatigue management with our patients all the time, but that particular aspect of the role and how you do it, how do you need to modify things, how do you communicate with your children or your grandchildren to allow them to understand what you can and can't do, hadn't really been, part of specific work, and it's certainly not out there in terms of specific tools or language that I can hand to my patients to use in those settings. And so that's the kind of thing where we might have said, well, yes, fatigue is very important in general, but that specific role and what those nuances might be and the specific things that people needed for us to be able to help them address that, I think would have been missing. And so I think that was an illustration of why we really needed to do this, and why I hope that we'll incorporate more of those approaches going forward. They take more time, they're more complicated, but you get much greater value from the effort, I think.
Yeah, no, I just second that. That Ruth Ann was saying, some of the things that people came up with, as a clinician who sees MS patients almost every day, were no surprise, but there were just as many, as Ruth Ann was pointing out, like fatigue as it relates to their parenting strategies that people were interested in, that I feel like come up really infrequently, actually, in my office. Or one of the other ones I remember was a number of focus groups brought up pelvic floor physical therapy as it relates to sexual dysfunction, and how underprepared that they felt walking into that experience and not knowing what to expect, which is something I hadn't thought much about in sending people there in the clinic, and sort of how disturbing that first experience could be, and something they were quite interested in, and how to prepare people, or sort of more objective outcomes in thinking about that I would have never thought of had we not involved this sort of group, and had they not been so vulnerable and willing to participate as part of the experience, which I think was a credit to the design and a credit to Marcia and leading the groups.
Yeah, and I would say that really comes across in terms of the publication lists, the highest priority questions for each research topic. We've touched on a couple of them already, and I'd love to go into more detail with that. But as someone as well who has conversations with people living with MS every day in a different capacity, not in a clinical setting, what I will say is that I found the questions that came out of it really novel and really interesting, and not the standard ones that we necessarily hear every day. And I think that is really testament to the design that was done, that it was able to really delve into some things that we're not thinking about. And that was really the motivation for doing this. So congratulations on that, because I think that really comes across as being achieved as part of the process.
Another part of the process that came up again, I think is a credit to what you do, or what you're doing here, was there were things that would come up that were sort of well established, or that we had known about women's health, that it was quite clear that information wasn't getting out to the community and to patients with MS. Questions along the lines of anesthesia around delivery of a pregnancy and things like that that would come up, and we realized we need to do a better job with this part too, in the dissemination. So I think this is very cool to be doing today.
So, as I said, we've touched on a couple of the outcomes already, but I'd love to go into a bit more detail with some of them and some of the other ones that you found. What were the biggest things for each of you that came out of this?
For me, I think the sort of menopause-related work came out as important, in part because when we looked at, there's a period where we were, prioritizing broad areas, and what we saw was that it was a much higher priority for women and care partners than it was for the clinician researcher advocate group. And so for me, that discrepancy in priorities highlighted the importance of involving people with MS. And when I looked at the questions, they are in fact the questions that I would like to know the answers to in clinical practice. So, and we have some small studies, but really not definitive ones, like how do perimenopause and menopause affect people's disease activity and their clinical course? And how does it affect their day-to-day symptoms and quality of life? I mean, we know menopause can be miserable experience for some women, with fatigue and difficulty with sleep and mood disturbance and brain fog. Those are also symptoms that women with MS commonly experience. And so, another key question is, like, how does MS affect that experience? So we heard often in the focus groups, like, how do I know? Is it my MS getting worse? Or is it perimenopause? Like, how do I know? How do my clinicians know? How do I therefore decide what to do about it? So those types of questions are things I think we need to, sort out, and understanding, how the therapies that we use, whether they're disease modifying or symptomatic, might alter timing or severity of menopause symptoms, whether they alter ovarian function, are all open questions to which we do not have the answer. And so that set, I thought, was particularly important because it's so clinically relevant to such a large proportion of the clinic population that we see.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Pregnancy was, sort of another subtopic that remained a top priority sort of across the different types of respondents, patients, their care partners, clinicians, researchers. That stood out to me because after the scoping review, we realized that was the area that had the most data, and yet it was still where people felt like a lot more research was needed, expressed a ton of interest in, and when they came up with questions, we don't have great answers to a lot of the things that they're still talking about. So I think had we sort of stopped earlier on in this process, I wouldn't maybe have put it as high up, but finishing through the whole priority setting and leaving with that really stood out to me as well. And then I guess I would just say, just the general interest in women's health and MS. I mean, to see 1,400 people respond to our initial global survey just because they got an email and they took a few minutes out of their day. I was impressed to see the MS community, sort of grab onto that so quickly. So it seems like there's a lot of interest across the board.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the other ones, just to focus on slightly, because I think it also gives credit to the way it was done and the way people were allowed to voice their thoughts, and in a very safe setting, was that one of the questions that came out was around managing sexual dysfunction. We know from the literature that this is something that people living with MS experience relatively commonly, but it still seems, in terms of discussions that we have, that it's this relatively taboo. People aren't necessarily comfortable talking about it, expressing their thoughts on it. How do we manage it? And it's just something that people try and cope with silently. So I think the fact that it's come out in this is really important. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest pieces that, I'll also take back to my clinic and talk about some of these questions with my patients, not just, hopefully we get more answers in research and there's more funding directed to this, but, it just opens the door for questions I know maybe on their mind that I can help, bring up and ease into them with just back in the clinic setting as well.
I think it was interesting that, it wasn't just that people brought up in focus groups, not just that it was hard to necessarily talk to providers about it, but just communicating with their partners. So that communication piece was a really important area. And when I think about, there was, as we talked about before, asking about things like pelvic floor physiotherapy as a solution. And, as a clinician, that's something I refer people for fairly often, but it only for the people who have coverage. And so it's often not covered by many plans. So it's an example of a common problem that even when you get to having the conversation about it, some of the tools that you want to be able to use may not be accessible. So it hasn't been, that particular type of physiotherapy doesn't get prioritized as much as others, and that to me is a policy gap for a population like this, that this type of physiotherapy is effective and as important as other types of physiotherapy that people do have coverage for.
And we know that doing this sort of thing and shining a light on this and raising awareness hopefully can, in the long term, start to impact on things like policy. Obviously, it's been a mammoth effort to get to this point, highlighted how many years it's taken to get here. But what are now the next steps and the future actions now that these research priority questions have been published? Where to next?
Well, right now, the things we're doing is, I think, trying to make people aware. So, we appreciate being invited to the podcast and, being discussed in blogs, starting to do, presentations to other groups. So I think particularly important, we need funding to help people answer these questions. So part of what we need to do is get this high enough on the radar of organizations that fund research that it does get funded, so we can answer these questions, using rigorous design, so we can bring it into clinical practice. I think as well, the MS advocacy organizations have the potential to do better what Lindsay pointed out, which is we heard lots of comments about things where she and I would have thought, well, but we know the answer to that question. Why is it that you haven't been able to find that information? Like, why is that not accessible to you? Or why does it seem like the information is conflicting? So, I hope that some of this work coming out and some of our discussions will, help those organizations to realize that maybe if they pull their information together in a single location and answer some of the questions that we do know the answers to, that will at least make people feel a little bit less alone and lost when they're trying to make decisions because they don't have access to, or feel they don't have access to, any high quality information.
Lindsay, any final thoughts from you on where to go next with this?
Yeah, no, I think Ruth Ann hit the high points. Maybe I'll just add that, hopefully we see that research efforts and funding sort of follow along the priority lines that we've discovered. That's been an issue in past James Lind priority setting efforts work, but it's been better of late. So I think keeping an eye on where research takes us next, and if it's really in line with the priorities, will be something of interest. And then, we're hoping probably to see more work looking into some of the populations where we got less responsiveness, we were less effective in reaching. Particularly, we didn't have a ton of people responding out of Central and South America and Africa, and some of the minority groups when people identified racial and ethnic ancestral backgrounds as well. So I think more work could be done along those lines too.
Well, look, thank you both very much for your time today to contribute to the podcast, and thank you for all of the really hard work that's gone into the publication, both from both of you and all of the others, authors and people that were involved in the project, and all of the people living with MS that contributed to the survey. Yeah, have a good one. And thanks everyone for listening to this episode. Once again, I'm Brett Drummond, host of this podcast episode. I'm also co-founder of MSTranslate, an independent resource centre that aims to simplify the complex wealth of information about MS for the greater MS community. The ECTRIMS podcast is produced and hosted in collaboration with two key partners, MSTranslate and the MS Journal, a peer-reviewed international journal that focuses on MS, neuromyelitis optica, and other related autoimmune diseases of the central nervous system. The ECTRIMS podcast is supported by an educational grant from Novartis, Roche, and Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. Educational grant providers have no input on the podcast series content. You can read more about the topic of this latest podcast episode and more on the ECTRIMS website, ectrims.eu. Do subscribe to the ECTRIMS podcast on your favourite podcast channels, and follow ECTRIMS on X, formerly Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube.